The Green Bay Packers trying to get back on top. Aaron Rodgers didn't have a great season last year. The Packers didn't have a great season last year. Rob Demovsky from ESPN.com and the NFL Nation had a great season, and we'll preview the Packers. And what was the big thing, Rob, as far as what happened last year on offense? Is it just simply not having Jordy Nelson and not having enough speed really caused Aaron Rodgers to have an off season?
John, I think that was a big part of it, but I think there were three things, two of them unexpected after the Nelson injury. And I wrote at the time of the injury that the Packers would be okay because they still had Eddie Lacy, who was coming off consecutive 1,100-yard seasons, and because this offensive line had played 17 of the 18 games altogether the previous year and were what Mike McCarthy called the best offensive line he's had in his tenure as a coach. But what happened was Lacy never got himself into game shape. The offensive line had myriad injuries. Josh Sitton, their Pro Bowl left guard, was the only one that started every game last season, and even one of those starts, he had to go play left tackle, completely foreign to him. So it was the combination of all three of those things, but it was definitely a trickle-down effect. Without the deep threat receiver and a lack of speed on the outside, Rodgers couldn't go deep. And then there's the Rodgers factor too, John, because, look, he was not sharp accuracy-wise. His yards per attempt was the lowest of his career. And then after the season, he has a knee scope, which tells you that his knee was bothering him at some point during that season, if not a good majority of it.
So how does he come into training camp and off the OTAs and off the minicamp?
Well, Mike McCarthy said it's the best shape he's been in. Rodgers told us that he is 218 pounds. That's the lightest he's been since McCarthy's first season. He revamped his diet, and really he took a page out of Tom Brady's book. He studied Brady and his nutrition. I believe Tom has a nutritionist or a chef that prepares his meals. Rodgers hasn't gone that far, but he did take a keen interest in nutrition. And of all things, being the quarterback in Wisconsin, he has cut most dairy products out of his diet. I wrote that this offseason he has given up cheese. So obviously not your typical cheesehead in Wisconsin, but he did it to prolong his career, really. He said that he wants to be able to play as long as he possibly can. And at age 32, he's starting to see that he needs to think about these things in terms of longevity.
What's the status of Jordy Nelson? And if we're going to know he's one on the PUP list to start training camp, how's that going to go?
Well, I really get the sense, John, that there's a good chance we may not see him in the preseason in terms of game action. Rodgers made a comment early in camp that, you know, even if Jordy doesn't play, we'll get some practice work together. That tells me he thinks he may not be able to play in any of these exhibition games with Nelson. It's not the ACL reconstruction in the right knee. It's the left knee had what Nelson called a, quote, hiccup during conditioning and during workouts this off-season, this summer, really, because when they broke for at the end of minicamp, there was no sign that there was any trouble. You do wonder, though, if it is a indirect result of the ACL and maybe, you know, he was favoring this knee and therefore something happened. It's certainly concerning, especially considering what Nelson means to this offense. But at this point, Nelson still says he thinks he's on track to play week 1 in Jacksonville.
The thing that was so noticeable last year was a lack of speed. You know, no Nelson, Devontae Adams isn't the fastest guy, Richard Rodgers is not the fastest guy. It just seemed that, you know, there was a real tough inability to get the ball downfield because there wasn't hardly anybody to get the ball downfield too.
Right, as good a year as James Jones had in a pinch, because remember they signed him after the Giants cut him at the end of camp. He's not a fast guy, and neither were those other guys that you mentioned. And it's the biggest reason they moved on from James Jones. Not that he's not a reliable target, because he was and had a very, very fine season considering, but they just didn't have the speed. So what they did was they went out and added Jared Cook, a tight end from St. Louis, who had an up-and-down career there, but he is a speed guy. Richard Rodgers, their tight end who caught the Hail Mary pass, is more of a plodding tight end, although he did lose a bunch of weight this offseason to try to get a little quicker. But Cook is a guy they hope can stretch the field down the middle, down the seam, but he, like Nelson, is still on PUP after having foot surgery in June. And then the other guy that sort of popped out a little bit here in camp so far, John, is Trevor Davis, the 5th-round pick from Cal. he was a guy who ran a 4.42 40 at the combine, and Elliott Wolf, Packers pro personnel director of football operations, said that they actually timed him on their own in the 4.3 range. So he looks like he's got a chance to maybe speed up this receiving group a little bit.
I know there's going to concerns long term about trying to keep this offensive line together. 3 guys that are going to be up at the end of the year. How can they keep more than one, or is it just going to be one?
Well, I think the smart money says it'll just be one, no pun intended on the money thing, because David Bakhtiari, their left tackle, is going to be a 10 to 12 to $13 million a year type of guy. That's just what left tackles go for. It's what we saw this offseason with what Cordy Glenn's deal. That's a similar type of deal with that Bakhtiari will see. And then you have the 2 older guys inside, Josh Sitton and TJ Lang. Sitton is easily their best offensive lineman, but he's a guy who's had some back trouble over the years, and he's now getting up there in years. And, do they want to invest in another big type of guard contract with him? And TJ Lang, who also has been a very, very good player, is coming off a shoulder surgery and just returned to practice 2 days ago, started on PUP. So they have to decide what they want to do. But what they did was they gave themselves some options by drafting Jason Spriggs, a tackle out of Indiana, in the 2nd round. And you know how conservative Ted Thompson is with draft picks, right, John? Well, he traded up to get Jason Spriggs. Tells you how much he liked him. That Ted Thompson does not trade up very often. So whether Spriggs is a guy that ends up replacing Bakhtiari if he leaves, or if they re-sign Bakhtiari, they play Spriggs at right tackle, and maybe they bumped Brian Bulaga to one of those guard spots. But either way, this is most likely the last hurrah for this offensive line that, as we said before, was and is one of the best Mike McCarthy's ever had.
Yeah, and that's sad because, it's hard to keep lines together. They have done such a good job, but transition always happens. And speaking of transition, I know Mike McCarthy finally came back just in the last day or so and said that he's never going to give up play calling again, something that he gave up last year. And I think if you look back, that was probably a mistake.
Yeah, he actually said it first right after the season, after the Arizona loss. He said, in this postseason or season wrap-up press conference, he said that I will, as long as I'm the head coach here, I will always call plays. Whether that was the reason that their offense, had some trouble last year, I think all those factors that we talked about earlier were probably a bigger factor, because even when McCarthy did take back the play calling late in the year, there wasn't a whole lot of statistical evidence to suggest anything had changed. But look, Mike McCarthy was hired in Green Bay in 2006 because of his offensive mind, his work with quarterbacks, his ability to game plan against defensive coordinators. And he has said it many, many times that part of it, the one-on-one matchup between the play caller and the defensive coordinator, is one of the things he enjoys most about coaching. And I understand why he did it. The reasoning that was sound at the time, coming off the Seattle loss in the championship game, in which they had all those breakdowns late in the game, defensively and special teams. He felt like he needed to make sure those areas were secure and things like that would not happen again. But in the end, there's only so much that one coach could do, and he spread himself too thin.
Yeah, and of course he is a very, very good coach. How's it look on defense so far? But we're talking to Rob Demovsky from the NFL Nation at ESPN.com. What's the changes that might be happening on defense?
Well, the 2 key ones are, one, moving Clay Matthews back to outside linebacker. The year and a half that he spent predominantly as an inside linebacker is over. It does not mean he won't go back in there, inside on certain plays and certain packages, but they want him rushing the passer. That's what he does best. But in order to do that, they had to find an athletic inside linebacker, and they think they have found that in a kid named Blake Martinez, 4th-round pick this year out of Stanford. And from day one, he has been the starter in all of the defensive packages. He is their 3-down linebacker, meaning he will stay on the field in the dime package. So they think they have found a guy that will allow them to play Matthews on the outside. And then the one other thing to note is that Kenny Clark, their 1st-round pick, defensive tackle out of UCLA, has really gotten off to a good start and might even be a better pass rusher than they thought he was. They knew he was stout against the run, and he and Mike Daniels provide a pretty good combination of short but stout guys inside. But Clark looks like he can get after the passer a little bit too.
Okay, finally, is there confidence that they can jump back over the Minnesota Vikings in the division?
Well, I think there's a feeling among some people in the organization that, look, the Packers, they had their worst year offensively since before the Brett Favre era. They had all these problems injury-wise with Nelson, Lacey's conditioning on the offensive line, like we've talked about, and they still won 10 games. They still were a playoff team. They still won a wild card game, and they still got to the divisional round where they lost in overtime. So they don't believe that they're that far away. Now, certainly their respect level for the Vikings and Mike Zimmer and Adrian Peterson and the defense that they've assembled over there is high, and the Vikings definitely have their attention. But I don't think there's a sense within the organization that they have lost or they're slipping and losing ground. I think they just had a really bad year offensively, yet they still were a 10-6 football team.
Okay, well, Rob, good preview. It's going to be a fun season. Looking forward to seeing you.
Thanks, John. Good to talk to you.